Hi, good evening. Gemma here. Tonight I'll be speaking on the third episode of a Panorama of Prophecy, and I'll get right to it. In the first episode, which was part 0, we just painted a brief picture of what our objectives were and why we see prophecy all through the scriptures. And I should mention at this point that the reason why I'm doing this is because I think it is quite important that we see how that prophecy is both atomic, as in it's a small indivisible piece, and it's a broad picture at the same time, hence the title, The Panorama of Prophecy. It's also very important that we see how that everything we see in the scriptures actually buttresses, confirms other things in the scripture. And that's why we see in the book of Isaiah, where it talks about line upon line, precept upon precept, a little here, a little there. Essentially, the idea is that God does not throw all the information about a particular subject in one particular small space in the Bible. He distributes it all through the scriptures. And so in order to understand some of the things that we're going through in this life, in order to understand or appreciate some of the things that happen in these last days, and why we can confidently draw certain conclusions, is because of the whole panorama or picture of prophecy. And so today I'm going to go into another prophecy in the book of Genesis. I was tempted to look at Genesis chapter 5. Maybe we'll do that some other day. What I'll do is, in fact, I'll leave a link in the description that talks about a quasi-prophecy in the book of Genesis chapter 5. And I say quasi not because it's not a real prophecy. It is. It's just that it's not as overt as you would just achieve by reading the English Bible. If you read the Hebrew Bible and you had an appreciation of names in the Hebrew Bible, you will very likely appreciate what God is doing there or what God is saying there. But in reality, it's not as clear-cut, or it's clear. It's just that you have to do a bit of digging, which actually the Bible tells us to do. According to Proverbs chapter 25 verse 2, it says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. It is the honor of kings to search it out." But I won't waste time tonight. I will leave a link in the description for that piece of prophecy there. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Tonight I'm going to be talking about Abraham, his son Isaac, and God's promise, and effectively God's foretelling of a promised son. So let's go there very quickly. In Genesis chapter 22, I'll read from the beginning, from verse 1. It says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am." Now, one thing I should mention before I go any further is that, remember what I said last week and the week before. No, not last week, a few days ago. It's that don't accept anything anyone tells you just because the person had a platform. Don't accept anything anyone tells you just because the person held a microphone, just because the person stood in front of a pulpit, or because the person showed up on your mobile phone or on your television. You accept what a person says on the premise of its congruency, its agreement, its concord with what you see in the Bible. And we see in Acts chapter 17 from around verse 10 how that the Berean people, the folks at Berea, were of a mundable sort because they received the word of God with great eagerness of heart, but went back and searched the scriptures daily, proving that these things were true. In other words, they didn't just accept it because Paul told them. They accepted it because it agreed with the word of God. So I want you to be skeptical about what you're about to hear, and I want you to check the word of God as to whether this is true or not. If it's true, then by all means run with it. If it's not, then by all means ask questions, query it, get in touch, let's talk about it. Okay, so let's make progress here. In verse 2 of Genesis 22, he says, "And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac." Now that's very interesting. Before Isaac was born, in fact, 14 years before Isaac was born, Abraham had a son called Ishmael. And yet God says here, And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee. I will tell thee of. Now, two things I need to mention very quickly here. Number one, that God was trying to establish a pattern here, which was part of the reason why he said, thine only son. God did not make a mistake. God does not make mistakes. When he says something, he means it, and there is always a meaning behind it. And he says here, take now your son. Now, if he stopped there, that would have been fine. But he says, take now your son, your only son, Isaac. Now, when you search the scriptures and you look for the phrase only begotten son, you find it in the New Testament speaking about Jesus Christ. So that gives us a bit of a clue of what's going on here. The second thing I wanted to mention is that in the Old Testament, and in particular with regard to the Jews, the Hebrews, and the Hebrew pattern of prophecy, prophecy is pattern. In other words, there's many things that God said in the Old Testament which were direct predictions, like when he spoke in Genesis 3:15, which was what we looked at a few days ago. That is a direct prediction. So prophecy can be prediction. But in the Jewish tradition, or in the Jewish custom, or even from a biblical point of view, prophecy is also pattern. And that's what we are seeing here. Prophecy as a pattern. Let me continue reading. It says, and he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and saddled his ass, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up, and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes, and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand, and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son. And here is repeated again, thine only son from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. Okay, so we'll stop there. There's a lot more being mentioned here, but we'll stop there for now. Now, let me just bring out a few things, and hopefully pretty quickly. Now, the first thing is, obviously, we see in verse 2 of Genesis 22, it says, Take now thy son, thine only son, which sounds a lot like John 3:16, which says, For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, or his only son. Okay, now that's not me clutching at straws. That's mentioned in many places in the Bible, but I'm trying to keep this brief. It says in verse, where is it now? Right, so in verse 7, and Isaac spoke unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. He said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself. God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went, both of them, together. God will provide himself. God will provide God with a lamb. God will provide God with a lamb as a sacrifice. Now, what you may not realize here is that what Abraham said here in Genesis 22 verse 8 is mirrored in Isaiah chapter 53 in verse 10, where it says, and I'll read to you from verse 1. Might as well just read from verse 1. It says, "Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form, nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men." This is Jesus Christ, obviously. "A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he had borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." I should mention this in passing. There's been debates at different times about who exactly is responsible for the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. Was it the Jews? Was it the Roman soldiers? Was it Pilate? At different times, people have had various arguments. In fact, I heard something funny once. I've not actually looked at the video yet, but a friend sent me a video about a Kenyan lawyer who is suing the Jews and the Roman Catholics for killing Jesus Christ. What he's expecting to achieve, I have no idea, but apparently that's a thing. But you're going to see something very interesting here. It says in verse 6, in verse 5 it says, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." So, take that for coronavirus. With his stripes we are healed. In fact, 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 24, it says, "By his stripes we have been healed," past tense. So take that, hold on to it, take it and use it. It says in verse 6, "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord hath laid on him," Jehovah hath laid on him, Jehovah had laid on Jesus Christ the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. Just like Isaac, just like Abraham said in Genesis 22, "He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth." Now you're going to see something very interesting in a couple of verses. It says, "He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken, and he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he hath done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth." Now look at verse 10. "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him." It pleased the Lord to bruise him. And I'm just checking something here. Okay, it's not what I thought. But anyway, it says, "It pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, and he shall prolong his days. The pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." Remember when Jesus said on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" The Bible is telling us here in Isaiah 53 verse 10, it says, "It pleased the Lord to bruise him." Now, I'm not saying the Lord took delight in killing Jesus Christ. What I'm telling you is that just like Abraham was about to sacrifice his only begotten son, the God in heaven, some 1,000 or 1,500 years later, or just over that, close to 2,000 years later, well, certainly between 1,500 and 2,000 years later, sacrificed his own son. Except that in the Old Testament, in Genesis 22, God stopped, the Lord, Jehovah, Yahweh, Yud-He-Vav-He, stopped Abraham. He said in verse 12, in verse 11, and the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. Thy son, thine only son, from me. The reason why God wanted to do this was to test Abraham, but he was not just testing Abraham to see whether Abraham trusted him. God was establishing a pattern. God was establishing a pattern for something that was going to happen in the future. Dr. Chuck Missler once said something a few years ago. He said, the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, and the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. I'll repeat that. The New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, and the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. In other words, there are many things that are happening in the Old Testament. There are many things that are written, they are said, they are done in the Old Testament that we don't understand until we get to the New Testament. But when we get to the New Testament, what things happen in the Old Testament all of a sudden start to make sense. So for example, what happened here in Genesis chapter 22 makes absolutely no sense without the cross of Jesus Christ. What happened in Genesis 22 makes absolutely no sense without seeing what happened in Revelation chapter 5 when we see the lamb that was slain. The point I'm trying to make is that here God is establishing a pattern for himself at some future date sacrificing his own son. Him at some future date sacrificing his own son. It's interesting. Somebody mentioned this to me once. It's also interesting that one of the things that happened in Genesis 22 with regard to Abraham and Isaac is if you look at verse, where is it now? I think it was verse, oh boy, this is the part where he puts the wood on Isaac. He says, take your son. Abraham rose up early in the morning, then on the third day he lifted his voice, took the wood. Yes, verse 6, it says, and Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. So this was going to be the object on which his son was going to be sacrificed. The burnt offering was going to take place on the wood that he placed upon Isaac his son. Now, interestingly, that happens again, except that this happens to Jesus Christ in John chapter 19 in verse 17. Look at verse 16. He says, then he delivered him therefore unto them to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. Now, if you read Genesis 22, I bet you could even find things that I have not mentioned, because it's interesting, the God that we serve, the Father of creation, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, Jehovah, the Lord. It's interesting how he hides things, he conceals things in many different places, and tasks us with the responsibility of finding this out. In a few days, or maybe even tomorrow, if I get a chance, I'll come out with the fourth part of this series. But suffice to say that God is establishing here in Genesis 22 a pattern that tells us about what is going to happen in the future. Well, it has happened for us now because Jesus died on the cross about 2,000 years ago. But the point is, God was establishing then a pattern for what was going to come. And the reason why God was so pleased with Abraham, and Hebrews 11 alludes to this, it's even mentioned here in Hebrews 22 in verse, I believe it's in verse 12. It says, and he said, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. In other words, God was extremely pleased with Abraham because Abraham fulfilled the pattern. which contrasts what happened with Moses, where Moses did not fulfill a pattern, and so Moses got punished for that. And I suspect we'll deal with that at some point when we look at the books of Exodus and Numbers. Suffice tonight to say that Abraham made a good impression on the Lord today, on that day, because Abraham allowed the Lord to establish a pattern that was prophecy and was referring to what his son was going to do at some point in the future. I'll be with you again in a day or more. God bless you in the meantime. Have a good night. Bye.